Welcome everyone to another Diversitas podcast. Diversitas meets you at the intersection of diversity, business, and culture. And today we are so happy to have with us Marc Womack, who besides being a longtime friend of mine, a stellar husband, father, son, and brother. On the side, he also holds the position of Executive Vice President of Operations at Santander Consumer USA. Marc is a longtime corporate leader, previously holding senior leadership positions with TD Auto Finance and JP Morgan Chase, among other esteemed organizations. In other words, Marc is a big dog, and we are happy to have him. He is actually one of the best, I don't know, best is not the right word. We'll see whether he's the best, but certainly most prominent guest that we've had on our show, and we are very, very happy to have him. So with no further ado, welcome, Mr. Womack.
Thank you, man. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, my friend. Good to see you. I'm so happy that you could spare some time for us as we continue down this path, growing our show, and we really are, greatly appreciate having you on.
My pleasure.
So what I wanted to talk about today, I mean, I could talk about a lot of things, and I'm going to let the audience in on a little something. Audience, Marc Womack is a great dude. He's also kind of a smart behind, and he tries to, every once in a while bust balls. And I think I can say that. Maybe I can't, and our producer will cut that later. And he tried to do that over a text message earlier because he was a little trepidatious. Well, let me put you at ease, my friend. We're going to take it easy on you today. And really what I wanted to talk to you about is leadership, because your resume speaks for itself. You've had a number of very, very responsible positions in corporate America. And I really wanted to talk to you about, number one, what's it like to lead organizations like the ones that you have led and that you continue to lead. And also, what is it like for you as a diverse leader? Because you are a diverse leader, and I would be remiss without making that very important point. So let's start with this. How would you describe your leadership style?
So I think, like most things, is a bunch of stuff, but I think if I start off, I would say it's very collaborative. I'm not a you must do guy. And I think that I like it to be collaborative, and you'll appreciate this story if you'll forgive one starting right off the bat. But, one of the things that I learned a long time ago is, and it was at Carnegie Mellon University. It was one of the first lessons that I learned in our first semester at Carnegie Mellon. I had never met anyone at that particular point in time in my life, and it's going to sound arrogant, but I don't mean it that way, that I ever felt like was smarter than me. And the people that had got better grades than me, people worked harder than me, but I never really met anyone that I felt like was smarter than me. And then I got there, and there were those private school guys from New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia and other places that were just smarter than me. And they were always going to get the 90 and I was always going to get the 80 or whatever. So it was very challenging to me, because I'm like, okay, are these guys always going to beat me? And are they always going to finish ahead of me? And so that really is one of the things that crystallized in my mind. And I didn't learn that till much later, right? It was at that point, it was a difficult pill to swallow. But much later, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the smartest guy in the room.
Why didn't you tell me that I had such a major impact on you?
It was tough. It was real tough. But I had to keep that secret, man. So I'm sorry. We're dishing it all here today.
But all jokes aside, it's interesting that you bring up Carnegie Mellon, because for the audience, we started off at Carnegie Mellon together. We were actually roommates. Oh my God, we were roommates in our freshman year. Marc had an apartment, and I moved in with him, I guess, the second semester of our freshman year. And so his experience, the experience that you speak about in terms of being with people who, for the first time, I mean, unlike you, I've always been around people who were probably a little more academically accomplished, we'll say, than I was. But certainly at Carnegie Mellon was the first time that, and I tell the story all the time, where we had most of the people in the room when we came to Carnegie Mellon and we started out at CMAP. Most of those kids had better grades than I did. Most of those kids had higher SAT scores than I did, but to your point, that because you are, academically accomplished does not mean that you're going to be a good leader, right? So in terms of your path, where else did you learn to be the leader that you are today?
Yeah, I think, again, I think a lot of the lessons were stitched together in my life, and I didn't really pull them all together till, probably after I was married, in my 30s, that I pulled all this stuff together. But, I was very lucky that I had lots of role models in my family that looked like me, that were executives in different organizations. My father was in the US Postal Service and ran vehicle maintenance for the entire metropolitan Detroit area. I had an uncle that was a corporate attorney for Ford Motor Company and for the Atlantic Richfield Company. And then my grandfather, who worked, had a 5th grade education and worked for 20 years at a malleable metals foundry. All of these guys really gave me a lot of real strong examples about work ethic and really how you get people to align behind you. And then in the more corporate setting, I was fortunate enough to have a number of role models that were diverse and non-diverse, quite honestly, that either saw something in me or saw that I was doing stuff wrong and said, let me help this guy, or saw that I was doing stuff right and said, hey, keep doing that. And was able to knit a lot of those things together. So I've been very lucky that I've had a lot of real strong role models and mentors and sponsors over the course of my life that have whispered in my ear at really critical times to help me learn some of those lessons, and quite honestly, let me fail a little bit and learn some of those difficult lessons. But it's been over the course of time that I've had those influences, for sure.
Well, one thing I will say about you is interesting. When I think about you as a young man, when we met, I guess you were probably 18, I was 18, is that you had a level of, I think, self-assuredness. And I've been thinking about this over the past couple of days. It's not, I wasn't thinking about this certainly when we were, messing about as freshmen. But you did have a self-assuredness about you, a self-confidence, you knew who you were, or you at least appeared to know who you were when you were that young. Do you attribute that to the role models that you speak of?
Yeah, I think so, because I never knew that the things that I didn't have. And so it was a very early example of now discovering your strengths and really building off of those things that were strengths. And all of the men in my family were very extroverted, very gregarious, very people-oriented folks. And so when I would see that and I would role model that, and so it was one of those things that was something that I always felt like I could lean on, and I think that helped me to, at least at that particular point in time, to help start the straw man of kind of the person that I was ultimately going to be. Because once I determined that I couldn't lever my my strength against raw intelligence, I had to develop other stuff.
Right.
So it was really a function of adding that breadth as opposed to that depth. And I think a lot of that came from a lot of those role models.
What position, when you think back in your career, what position do you recall where you first thought to yourself, okay, I have a lot of responsibility now?
So it was probably, I worked for a British bank, HSBC, very large organization. And I had the opportunity to lead the credit card business for Saks Fifth Avenue. And at that time, Saks owned, in addition to Saks Fifth Avenue and off Fifth Avenue, they owned about 9 regional department store chains that would be akin to a Macy's now, or a Dillard's or something like that. And they were local, in different markets. But that was the first time that I really started looking at the impact of the responsibility that I had, from a financial statement perspective, and looking at, gosh, there are $3 billion of sales that go through these cards every year. And it was one of those things that was kind of scary at the time, because it was one of those things that you're doing your job and you're just thinking about the day to day. And then you look up and you say, wow, this is something that this kid from, suburban small town Michigan outside of Detroit, it was definitely something that kind of hit me. But that was probably the first time.
Ypsilanti.
There you go. That's right.
So you've been on the, is it correct to say that you've been on the consumer side the majority of your career?
Majority. I've done some commercial banking, but I dare say the largest preponderance was on the consumer side.
And so when you have these kind of more responsible positions on the consumer side, like, what is your responsibility to driving the bottom line?
So in different roles, it's been different things. So,
right.
In that job, it was really about getting, card utilization and card activation. So when customers came in and got their cards, I wanted them to use them and then keep using them. So we would have to come up with marketing strategies to help them to do that. As I got into the auto space, it was really around both on the revenue side, but also on the expense side, on the servicing side. So it's how do I make sure that I'm taking care of the customers once they're on the books, so that they continue to live up to their contractual obligations. And if they slip, what are we doing to try to help them? And so I've been on kind of both sides of the of the income statement, on the revenue generation side, as well as on the the expense and on the servicing side.
Okay. As a leader, what do you consider to be the most important values for leaders?
So I guess I would say, so transparency is big for me. And I think that telling people the truth is always going to be the next best step, even if that's a difficult message to deliver to an individual or to a group of people. And I've had to do both. I've had to announce that sites were closing and people were losing their jobs, and and we've had acquisitions, and there's huge opportunities. So I think truth and transparency are really, really important hallmarks of good leaders that I've seen in my career. And then I think commonality and singularity of purpose, and and it gets back to that whole transparency and clarity piece of it, because I think good leaders also kind of, there's 2 points that you have to be able to firm up. The first one is where you are, and the second one is where you're going. And then the stuff in the middle is where, from my experience and my perspective, is where the team comes in. And how you really, get high performing teams is how do you engage people in that stuff in the middle. But the leaders really got to make sure that everybody is level set on where you are and where you're going, so that the transparency, that clarity, and that truth is really, I think, very important in terms of driving strong leadership.
And what's interesting about that, because when you think about this type of position, the type of position you have, CEO positions, etc., what's often bandied about when you read the news or whatever the case may be is kind of the top line. This is the revenue, this is whatever, and you're thinking about all of these dollars, etc. But really, it seems to me that on a day-to-day basis, what you are doing is really managing people and really trying to drive as much efficiency out of people as you possibly can. Am I kind of?
Yeah, I would say it slightly differently, because to me, managing people implies that you know what you're supposed to be doing. And I think that those two kind of signposts are really the helpful thing. And the way, as I think about leadership, if you ask me how I would define leadership, to me, leadership is unlocking success in other people. And so if you do that, and you're not the smartest person in the room, you will come up with a better answer than you would have if you're the one standing up in the middle of the room and saying, okay, you do this, and you do this, and you do that. It's just, okay, all of us know we got to move the wagon from here to over there. How do we do that?
How do we do that?
Right? What are the things that we do? So I try to ask more questions than to make more statements about things. And yeah, at the end of the day, sometimes I have to be the tie-breaking vote on things, because you can't just debate forever. But what I find is that, my style is I'm very comfortable with having people tell me how bad my ideas are. So I'm happy to throw something out there as a target to have people throw at. And I think that process of kind of creative, respectful kind of debate and dialogue does a couple of things. It really drives better outcomes because people feel like that their voices are heard. And I think it derives better input from people because they know that their approaches are going to be respected. Whether they're actually adopted or not, to me, is less important because, I very rarely am the one that comes up with the best idea, and I think that's okay. It's not for me, because if I am, then the team is probably sub-optimized. I am consciously trying to hire people that are smarter than me on a bunch of different dimensions. And I think that way, the team learns from each other. I learn from the team, and then, I think I bring the stuff that I have to the table that I do better than everybody else. And we get the better outcomes as a function of that process. So I guess, somebody might say, okay, well, that is managing the team. I just don't like the word manage because it implies an intentionality that sometimes doesn't really actually exist in practice.
So besides what you just talked about, what would you say are your other strengths as a leader?
Yeah, I came up with a word a long time ago, and I always have had respect for people who are entrepreneurs and people that have the vision to be able to go out and make a way when there isn't any way. And I have never had the courage personally to go out and take that swing that, I'm just saying, hey, I know that this thing is better than, the iPhone is better than everything else that's out there. And I'm putting my entire soul on it. I've never been that. My risk tolerance hasn't been to that place. But the word that I came up was entrepreneur. So I think I'm really good at innovating within the constraints of a large organization. So I'm able to find ways to get things done in the confines and within the constraints of the organization in ways that may not have necessarily been thought of. So I think I bring a lot of that entrepreneurial spirit, but aligned and governed with some of the practical realities that exist in large organizations.
Can you, without breaching any, we haven't signed an NDA. Can you give an example of innovation though?
Yeah, I think so I'll give you an example. It's a car example. And so, I worked with a number of manufacturers that, and this was an example when I was with Chase. So I'm fine to speak of that. But, they're trying to sell as many cars as possible. And we as the financer want to finance as many of those vehicles as possible. And sometimes those objectives are at cross purposes because the manufacturer wants to have campaigns that are out there like 0%, but they want to do those as cost effectively as possible. And the bank obviously wants to make a return on the investment that they're putting out there.
Right.
And so a lot of it is around how do you take the objectives of each of those areas and figure out ways that, and without getting too specific, to figure out ways to say that, okay, here are the 3 things that you actually care about. And here are 2 things that you don't. And here are those 2 things that are actually really important to me. And here are 3 things that I don't really care about that are really important to you. It's putting those things together in a package that says, well, I know you like these 3 things and I like those 2 things. So if we do those things, we'll together, and it's the quintessential win-win scenario, but right. It's how do you package that and really tell that story? Because a lot of times organizations will look at those things as individual things. And I try to look at them as a collective, kind of picture, as opposed to, an independent part of the picture, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, I'm looking at, full disclosure, I'm looking at, because of what we're doing in our businesses, I think we need a truck, right? Mm-hmm. So I've been looking at trucks and no disrespect to you or your industry, but I'd rather not get a car note because I hate car notes. But let's say I might get a car note, but I'm looking at the prices of these cars and I'm just like, are you serious right now? And I'm not even talking about the new ones. Right? Tell me about what's going on with the car industry right now.
Yeah, so COVID has had an incredible impact on the automotive ecosystem. And so it's not just car makers, it's car suppliers, it's banks, it's dealers, it's all of these things. And so simplistically, what happened was when COVID first started, all of the major factories in the US stopped building cars. And then all of the parts suppliers that supplied all of the widgets to all of the car companies, they stopped making stuff too. So computer chips and all of those other things. So all of those things stopped for 90 days. The problem with heavy manufacturing is it's more like a hose than a light switch. So it goes off like a light switch, but when you turn it back on, it's like turning the water on in the hose. You got to wait till the water gets to the end of the hose before you start seeing stuff coming out the other end. And so what you basically had was a 6-month gap in the beginning of 2020 where no cars were getting made, no parts were getting made, no parts were getting shipped. So it slowed everything down. Then what you started seeing is the chip manufacturers who make all the chips that power all of the electronics in cars started saying, okay, and this is something that most people don't really understand about chip manufacturing. I won't get too wonky here, I promise. But the chips that go into cars are actually pretty low tech versus the chips that go into phones and computers and televisions and all those other things. So the chip manufacturers said, okay, I don't have to make car chips anymore. I'll start making all these other chips. And if you remember during that time, Samsung and Apple and Sony, their sales went like crazy. And those chips are much higher margin than the chips that go into cars. So now you've got supply chain issues on top of supply chain issues. Because now the chip manufacturers are saying, wait a minute, why should I start making these really low tech, low margin chips when I can sell the same capacity to Apple and make 4 times as much money? And so that really slowed things down even more. So the long and the short of that is that the new car production basically ground to a standstill. And so when you don't have new cars to buy, well, the law of supply and demand says you buy whatever's available, which are used cars. And so used cars increased in value 35% year over year. And so now you've got this really weird dynamic that if you can find a new car, even paying full MSRP, full sticker price for that new car is probably cheaper than a 2-year-old used car of the same value, the same, manufacturer. So it's kind of a crazy, situation we're finding ourselves in.
And what's interesting about that is how does that impact, because the value of the 2-year used car on the books, is less than what they're selling it for, presumably. And somebody who wants to come to Santander and get a loan, they need to have more money up front, don't they, to really buy the car? Because you're not, the loan to value is what it is.
Yeah, so actually it's kind of the opposite. So a car that was purchased 2 years ago is actually worth a whole lot more now. And what customers are finding out is the price that they paid for the car 2 years ago, a lot of them are getting that same price to trade in that car today. So they effectively have been able to drive a car for free for 2 years. So if I spent, and again, simplistically, if I spent $20,000 on a car 2 years ago, I could probably trade that car in for 21 today. And so the fact that the price of the new car has gone up is lessened to a degree because I've actually got more equity coming out of the car that I'm selling than I typically would after 2 years. 2 years is actually the worst time to trade in a car because you're still at the steep part of the depreciation curve. But now it's like you've gotten, cars typically go down in value 100% of the time. Other than collectible cars, 69 Mustangs, that kind of stuff. But yeah, pretty much every car has gone up in value to some degree or another. And SUVs and crossovers have gone up the most in this period of time.
So how has all of this kind of flux in the industry impacted your business?
So the leasing side is actually the easiest because typically what happens when a customer leases a car, it's usually for 3 years. And at the end of that 3-year period, the customer has the option to buy that car or to give it back. And in most cases, we get the majority of those cars back because when the lease starts, you predict what the value of that lease is at the end of that 3 years. It's called the residual value. And so you bet on that lease and it's 50%, right? That's what you kind of think. Well, the cars have been coming back in and they're worth 60%. So now we're not getting any of those cars back. The customers are buying those cars or dealers are buying those cars. So from that perspective, we're not losing any money on those cars, but we're not actually getting any of the benefit of the gains either because the customers are taking that. So from a loss perspective, we've actually over the last couple of years been doing really, really well because customers have been taking advantage of not only the inflation in used car values, but also a lot of the government stimulus programs that have been out there. That's been helping customers to stay current and not have, a lot of issues from a payments perspective.
All right, so I appreciate that education. That was very interesting. I do have a question. I kind of teased it at the beginning. I did want to talk a little bit about what your experience has been as a diverse leader in corporate America.
Yep.
So, can you speak to kind of, do you feel it's been different than kind of non-diverse leaders? If so, how so?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it definitely has. And I think that there's a couple of thoughts that I would say. And I think one of the things I've always talked about is when people talk to me on the phone, and this is before the era of Zoom when they would see you.
Right. Yes.
People would talk to you on the phone and then they'd see you. And I could always tell when I looked different than those people thought that I had because I would get that when I would walk in the room. And so there was a lot of, change in perception of what people thought that I was after people actually met me versus when they didn't meet me. And that's a simplistic thing. But I feel like, has it been more difficult? I don't know. It's hard for me to compare because I've only had my experience.
Right.
Now,
right.
I've seen others that and again, it's the reverse of what I talked about in the beginning about, people that were more intelligent than me. I felt like there were people whose capabilities didn't compare as favorably as mine and were able to advance and matriculate through the organization at a more rapid pace. But I think I've been very fortunate in the sense that, I have always been able to either through intentional, kind of efforts that I've put forth or organizationally that people have said, hey, they've seen something in me that I've always been connected with definitely the most senior, African-American or diverse folks in whatever organizations that I've been in. And then, in terms of opportunities, I feel like I've been given the chance, which is all really, I think any of us really want. So I don't know that chances have been withheld from me from that perspective, but I definitely feel like expectations have been different over the course of my career for me than for some of my peers, for sure.
Who would you say, if you had to pick, let's call it 3 leadership role models, who are your 3 leadership role models?
That's a really good question. I would say my father is first and foremost, because he was one of the first folks that I ever saw stand up in front of a meeting, a room and just kind of command the room. Face, personally, you see people on TV do that, but I saw him stand up in front of people and I didn't know what he was doing at the time, but I was like, I really like how people are looking at him. And I like the effect that he's having on people. So I think that has been a person that I have always tried to role model and to live up to. I think, one of the other ones, and this is, my grandmother had this picture in her house, and it was, it's an old picture, and I'm sure lots of people have seen it. And the picture is of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy. And each of them have they had a quote underneath them that they said. And the quote under Bobby Kennedy is something that I've always thought about. And I've always thought he was a really strong leader in his own way. And the quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was something along the lines of, some men dream and see the world as it is and ask why. I look at the world as it could be and ask why not. And I've always thought that was a really interesting thought about leadership and how you really think about, that. So I always thought he was another role model from a leadership standpoint that I thought was very, very interesting. And then the third one, from a corporate leadership perspective, I always respected Ken Trinalt from American Express.
Mm-hmm.
And I really respected him because he was in, and again, aligned a lot with the consumer finance business that has been near and dear to my career. And the transformation that he did at American Express and really the longevity that he had there and the respect that he had and his approach to engaging the marketplace and just a lot of the way that he went about his business, I always thought was just really impressive.
So you work for Santander, you've worked for TD, you've worked for HSBC, you've worked for a lot of companies based in other countries.
Uh-huh.
Do you find those corporate cultures different than American corporate cultures?
Absolutely. Every single one of them are different in their own unique ways. And even my last company, TD, is a Canadian bank.
Right.
And people think about, Canadians as very much like Americans, and they're just not. And not in a good or bad way. There's just some very stark differences. And so I think about that. I think about, British bank. I'm in a Spanish bank right now, which is different. I worked for a Korean auto company, which was also altogether very different. So each of them had their kind of cultural richness that was very important in the way that you got things done.
So if I could do a little bit of a deeper dive with that, talk to me about the Korean bank and the culture with that bank and how that culture kind of manifested in terms of business practice.
Yeah, so there were, and this was something, if I'm honest, I underestimated when I was there. There is an entire, at least there was, I won't say there is, because I don't know. There was kind of the American executives that they had that were in seat. And so I was chief marketing officer for Hyundai Capital America. And then there were counterparts that were Korean for every major function. So finance, CEO, marketing. And my simplistic kind of approach to working is, my job is to make my boss look good, and my boss's job is to make me feel good about making them look good, right? That's kind of my model, right? That's the way I've always thought about it. And there was this whole other dimension that I didn't get for the first kind of 4 or 5 months. And so it was really that team was really critical to how things got done in the US and then got done, in Korea. And so it was a very different model than I had ever seen or I'd ever been exposed to. And again, not good or bad, it was just different. And so my historical approach didn't work as well in that organization because, I was so focused on my boss that I wasn't paying as much attention to this peer role that was really critical to my success. I just didn't understand it. And so when I figured it out, things got a lot better. And all of a sudden I magically was able to get things done a whole lot easier than I had before. But it was just a very different dynamic that didn't exist in any organization that I had been in previously. Okay,
last question in the leadership piece. Mm-hmm. What would you tell, if you could, what would you tell your younger self about being a leader?
A lot of it is, it's boring old adages that as I get older, I find out to be more and more true. Listen twice as much as you talk. One of the big things, and this is something that one of these mentors told me, and he told me a story, and he said, it was in my year interview. He was my boss at the time, and he said, I can always tell when you know the answer to a question in a meeting. And I said, how's that? And he said, because your elbows are on the edge of the table and you're like in a sprinter stance, ready to just go. And, and as you know, I'm not a little guy, and I'm even bigger than I was when I was in
You
college.
said it, I didn't. You said
Yeah,
it.
hey, the post-college 20-pound beer weight, for
Dude,
sure.
you and me both.
But it was one of those things that I consciously now in meetings, I am much more focused on how I'm projecting in those kind of situations. And so the lesson was that don't worry about being right, worry about making the right thing happen.
Mm-hmm.
And those aren't necessarily the same thing. And you can be right and completely gum up the works and make the project go off the rails or the initiative go off the rails. And the example that I always use is that if the objective is to start at 1 and get to 4, if I think the right answer is 1, 2, 3, 4, if I push 1, 2, 3, 4, and everybody else says the answer is 1, 3, 2, 4, and I don't really care about the 2 and the 3, but because I'm right, I'm focused on that, I can slow down the whole productivity of the team. And that really doesn't have anything to do with anything. So it's really, how do you focus on those critical, important things to make the outcome happen right, as opposed to being right. So
that let me tell you something. That is excellent, because as you were talking, I look back at my experience, and it took me a long time, probably longer than it should have, for me to get out of the mindset that I had to be right. Mm-hmm. And not only that I had to be right, but you had to know that I was right. That was more important. You had to know that I was right, right? Because at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily get you to where you're trying to go.
Yep.
From a goals perspective. So that's tremendous. All right. So we have this segment that we just recently started, which we call rapid fire. And so I'm going to ask you a series of questions. And I just want to get your response. And these have more to do about you than.
Sure.
Okay. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
So personal, business, either, both.
Whatever you want. Whatever is the most important to you. How about that?
Okay. My father told me a long time ago, don't let something that you can solve in 30 seconds keep you in something for 30 minutes.
Excellent. Give me one word that describes you.
Happy.
Oh, that's a great word. That's a great word. Tell me, what do you think your biggest success has been?
Like I said before, I think to me, the biggest thing that I enjoy is when I have people with whom I've worked in the past, and even people that I've potentially given really bad news to, come back to me later and say, you know what, I was mad at you then, but now I understand what you were trying to tell me. Mm-hmm. And those kind of interactions, and it's because, like I said, to me, that leadership thing is about helping other people. And so, the fact that I was able to help folks, that actually is the thing that is the most rewarding for me.
Biggest failure?
This week or
ever?
I think that I continue to do this. I'm better at it now than I was, but I think I overthink decisions sometimes. And I know in my heart what I should do. And sometimes I have this dialogue with myself where I try to continue to convince myself that more thought is going to make a better decision, and it just doesn't. So.
Okay, something a little lighter. Your favorite TV show?
I'm on a Ted Lasso thing right now. I've been binge watching Ted Lasso, so that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I got to catch up on that. I watched the first episode and I haven't watched it since. Yeah. And finally, your favorite musical artist?
Miles Davis.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Miles Davis.
I thought you were going to say Prince.
He's good too, but if I had to listen to one person forever, it'd be kind of blue. I just have that on a loop and just continue to play it.
That's tremendous. Marc Womack, we so appreciate you giving us a little bit of your very busy time. We also thank you, the audience, for continuing to listen to and watch our podcast. For those who don't know, we are now available on Spotify and Anchor. And so we look forward to seeing you again, look forward to having the conversation and keeping it going. Thank you very much. Take care.